Hi, my name is Emily Wise, and I'm going to be presenting about the cerebellum. The main components and connections. The cerebellum is part of the motor system located in the posterior cranial fossa and serves as the largest part of the hindbrain. It is behind the fourth ventricle, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, with the tentorium cerebelli separating the cerebellum from the cerebrum. Two hemispheres comprise the cerebellum and are divided into three lobes: anterior, posterior, and flocculongular, separated by two transverse fissures. The cerebellum is responsible for 80% of the brain's neurons organized in a thick cellular layer. The cerebellar cortex is a single sheet-like structure less than 1 millimeter thick with accordion-like folds that contain gray matter. The gray matter is divided into three layers. The layers include the molecular layer, the middle layer called the Purkinje cell layer, and the granule layer contained in the interior of the cortex. The cerebellar cortex is divided into three primary subdivisions: the posterolateral fissure, which separates the flocculongular lobe from the corpus cerebelli, the primary fissure, which separates the corpus cerebelli into a posterior lobe and an anterior lobe. Structure and functions. Synaptic receptors in the cerebellar cortex are well defined through multiple input and output signals. The extracellular cerebellar neurons project axons to the cerebellar cortex and deep cerebellar nuclei, referred to as mossy and climbing fibers. The dominant cell type in the region, the Purkinje cells, is where the mossy fibers synapse on granule cells. In contrast, the climbing fibers project completely to Purkinje cells, which are GABAergic. The Purkinje cells support inhibitory output to neurons of the deep cerebellar nuclei, the only cerebellum output structure. Efferent axons from cerebellar nuclei neurons transmit inhibitory signals to the inferior olive and excitatory output to the brain stem and thalamus. Even though the connections are well established, the physiological importance has yet to be established. The cerebellum is involved in maintaining balance and coordinating voluntary movements, while the striatum facilitates voluntary movement. The mediation of movements is done by both structures in the cerebellar cortex, while various neurotransmitters are integral parts of the circuits. Dopamine, serotonin, GABA, and glutamate, to name a few, interact in regulating the excitation and inhibition of motor neurons. Studies have long demonstrated the involvement of such neurotransmitters in the proper functioning of motor neurons in the striatum and cerebellum. The function of the cerebellum is most known for movement. The cerebellum is responsible for those functions when we learn motor skills or to maintain balance. Other functions of the cerebellum include cognitive processes such as language. Movement is not necessarily initiated in the cerebellum, but it does play an active role in the sequencing of movements. Damage to the cerebellum results in the inability to control fine motor movements, motor learning, and maintenance of posture. Functional anatomy. To help understand the functional anatomy of the cerebellum, the image included outlines the various components being discussed. The cortex of the vermis coordinates the movements of the trunk, including the neck, shoulders, thorax, abdomen, and hips. Control of the distal extremity muscles is by the intermediate zone of the cerebellar hemispheres located adjacent to the vermis. The remaining lateral area of each cerebellar hemisphere provides the planning of sequential movements of the entire body, along with movement in the conscious assessment of movement errors. How can this knowledge be used to help society? Abnormalities in the cerebellum are some of the most common neuroanatomical differences seen in people with autism, and correlations have been noticed with injuries at birth, substantially increasing the risk of developing autism. Irregularities in the cerebellum early in life may also have considerable effect and predispose individuals to conditions such as autism. Schizophrenia is another disorder that may be affected by the cerebellum. There has been little evidence in humans until recently when a group reported that stimulating the cerebellum with a method called transcranial magnet stimulation, also known as TMS, could lessen the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. TMS uses magnets to create electrical currents in the brain. If TMS therapy proves to be effective, it could fulfill a lifelong standing need. Antipsychotic medications can successfully reduce the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, such as hallucinations and delusional thoughts, but effective therapies for negative symptoms remain elusive. More research and testing are being conducted using cerebellar TMS, targeting the abnormalities in working memory, attention, and planning, which are all very similar in conditions including schizophrenia, autism, bipolar disorder, depression, and Parkinson's disease. The cerebellum is responsible for millions of connections and circuits affecting multiple areas. Therefore, the more research that is conducted, the better future therapy could be for various conditions. The cerebellum is one of the main parts of the brain and is accountable for coordinating movement and balance. The cerebellum is often referred to as the little brain and plays a major role in many motor activities. While many circuits and connections have been established in research, the functionality of all is not clear. However, there have been many astonishing findings and ways to use the knowledge of the cerebellum to better create therapies and treatments to aid in certain conditions and diagnoses.